Well, good morning and welcome to the Masters University webinar on Political Studies, History, and Humanities. My name is Vanessa Haynes and I'm the Admissions Event Manager here at TMU. We're thankful for the opportunity to virtually host you. We invite you to include your questions in the chat. The icon to open that is located in the lower middle of your screen. Just a few logistical items before we begin. Please note that your camera and microphone will be turned off during the session. We thank you in advance for your patience as we try to make best use of our technology. Though if you do get disconnected during the call, please go ahead and log back in using the original link included in your confirmation email. Lastly, just so you know, we are recording the session and we'll try to make that available to you as soon as possible. Well, today we're privileged to have with us Mitch Hopewell and Dr. Fraser. Their topic of conversation today is coronavirus, the Constitution, and Christianity. They'll be providing an overview of the undergraduate degrees as well. Mitch Hopewell is our interim provost and dean of online learning, academics, student success, and all of our online programming. Dr. Fraser is our professor of history and political studies. His academic areas of interest are the American founding and pre-19th century political philosophy. Our professor has authored a couple of books, including his newest release called God Against the Revolution. He has also represented TMU in various radio debates and conferences concerning these topics. Dr. Fraser attends Grace Community Church, where he's a deacon and leads a Bible study through a fellowship group there. Well, we're very excited to have you both with us and welcome everyone to this virtual webinar and ask you to just go ahead and begin the Q&A. Mitch?
Absolutely. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for joining us today. We are in an interesting period in our history, and we see a lot going on in the world around us, and there's a lot to think about. We certainly can't address every issue surrounding the current pandemic and the response that we're taking here in the U.S. But I wanted to just open up with a couple of questions, and you and I can have a conversation about some of the things that we see going on around us. You have been, I understand, thinking about how the response that our federal government and our state governments have been taking to address the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And I wonder if you wanted to just share some opening thoughts about that in relationship to how we are balancing public health and the needs of keeping people safe with some of our constitutional rights that maybe potentially First and Fourth Amendment specifically might be getting curtailed. So just give you an opportunity to open up some thoughts on that.
Yeah, obviously we're in a time of great difficulty and challenge and emergency. But one of my concerns, and it's a concern of others as well, is how quickly we sort of shed basic constitutional liberties whenever there's a crisis. Some people were concerned, for example, after 9/11, that the government was stepping on constitutional liberties in various ways. Probably not many in our audience will remember Franklin Roosevelt's internment of American citizens during World War II, arguably a greater crisis than this. I mean, I would say certainly a greater crisis than this, and a tremendous threat. But President Roosevelt took property, or allowed property to be taken away from American citizens, and them to be rounded up and sent off to other states to live in camps. Years later, when these things were adjudicated in courts, the courts were very critical of this violation of constitutional liberties in time of crisis. But that was time of war. The Constitution actually allows the president to do certain things during time of war that are not allowed now in peacetime. And so I'm concerned when I see the president, but more particularly governors and even mayors, violating constitutional liberties just by decree. There's no statute, there's no legislation, the lawmaking body. We're supposed to be a country that's rule of law, not rule by decree. That's the difference between a republic and a dictatorship. And when we have governors and mayors telling people where they can and cannot go, That's a violation of freedom of assembly, which is a First Amendment freedom. We're telling them you can't meet in groups more than 10 people. I think it's interesting. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has become a sort of a reality TV star over the last couple of weeks. The news networks are covering his press conferences every morning. I think it's interesting that there are more than 10 people in his press conferences, but churches are not allowed to meet with more than 10 people. There's no constitutional right to hold a press conference, but there is a constitutional right of free exercise of religion. And so I think that this is being used by some in a dangerous way. And I understand it's well-intentioned probably, but intentions are often a road to bad places. And so I just think that there needs to be more attention paid to the constitutional realities here, that we also have drones flying over beaches sent by the government to see where people are, and cell phone GPS being tracked. And even the sheriff of Los Angeles sent notes out to people saying, we know where you are. Well, that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is asking New Yorkers to snitch on their neighbors if they're doing these disapproved activities. Now, they're not breaking laws. There's no law here. There's a decree from the governor, but he doesn't really have authority, as I can see it, to make these demands. The role of the governor in this case is to convince, not to command. And so calling on neighbors to snitch on their neighbors if they're doing some disapproved activity, that's the kind of thing we see in other countries that are not what we would consider to be free countries. Mm-hmm. So I'm very concerned about it. Ben Franklin, actually among the founders, warned about this. He warned that Americans might be willing to trade their liberty for security. And that's a dangerous road to go down when you have one person assuming sort of dictatorial power without any checks or deliberation.
So you mentioned, you mentioned kind of that famous quote from Ben Franklin, and I wonder if, kind of what your thoughts would be. It sounds to me, if I'm observing things, that, the president has essentially said that he is going to allow the states to make these determinations, and it sounds, in your opinion, as though the decree, the rule by decree, is not in step with where we would say that our country would be, or theoretically be, based on a rule of law approach. I wonder if you might. Are there any examples that you can think of through history where we see, in addition to the ones you've given, where we see some of these balancing the public health or the public safety with some, sort of crisis time decrees?
Well, the only other times, I actually looked this up, and the only other times that emergency declarations were made by presidents for public health reasons, they consisted merely of freeing up money, of cutting regulations and freeing up barriers to facilitate getting money and needed health supplies out to the general public and so forth. There was never anything about you can't gather together in public, or you can't go out and go to work, or any of these types of things. This is unprecedented in American history, as far as I can tell. So those are the kinds of things that you can do if you invoke martial law in time of war or time of insurrection or rebellion. And Abraham Lincoln did some of that during the Civil War, for example. But it's never been used for a public health crisis. And so it's new territory, it's new ground. And I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't abide by recommendations to not meet together in large groups or not go out and do such and such and so forth. I'm just concerned about it coming down as decrees and about the threat of arresting people, like they have actual authority to do this. And I just don't see where they have the actual authority. When Governor Newsom of California first put out his decree, Professor George Crawford is a retired judge and teaches here at the Masters University in our political studies department. He and I looked at the statute. Newsom actually identified some statutes in California law, which he said allowed him to do this. And we looked at the statutes, and those statutes say that he can suspend certain state laws and state ordinances and state privileges and so forth, but it says nothing about the Constitution, because a governor cannot suspend the Constitution, and neither can the president, for that matter. Now, and I'm not suggesting that something shouldn't be done, but if it should be done, it should be done by the Congress, by the lawmaking body. That's the way we function in America, not by decree from a single individual, whether we like the individual or not. It has nothing to do with whether you like President Trump or don't, or like Governor Newsom or don't, or like Cuomo or don't. That's not the issue.
Yeah. So we see some stretching in some constitutional rights, and some may argue that they've been, snapped. But do you, as this resolves and we get through this, do you think that there's enough elasticity in the Constitution, in our rule of law, that this will come back? And I'll ask that in the context of the upcoming elections. How do you see the upcoming elections being impacted by or addressing maybe some recovery of some of these situations and decrees?
Well, so far the country has been able to come back from episodes like Franklin Roosevelt's in World War II, and again, some people believe after 9/11 that President Bush went over the line, or even Congress went over the line. A lot of people didn't like the Patriot Act, for example, and thought that it was a violation of constitutional rights. So on the one hand, I have a lot of confidence that America will spring back and be America. On the other hand, there has been somewhat, in my opinion, somewhat of a concerning drift in this particular direction. I think, people sometimes talk about President Trump is threatening as a dictator and so forth. And that's mostly people, I think, who just don't like him. But we have actually had some drift in that direction. People might recall that our previous president, President Obama, stood before a joint session of Congress in a State of the Union address, looking in the faces of Congress, and held up a phone and a pen, and he said, "I have a pen and a phone. If you don't act, I will." Well, that's not the way the United States works. If the legislative branch doesn't act, then the president waits for them to act, unless it's something that he has authority over. And he himself did the DACA thing after saying 9 times on public television appearances and in speeches, when people were urging him to do the DACA thing, he said 9 times, "I can't do that. I'm not a czar. I'm not a king. I don't have that authority under the Constitution." And then he did it. And nobody said boo. Well, he was sued by the other party, but in terms of the general populace and so forth, and Congress sat there while he said, "I have a pen and a phone, and I'll act if you don't," and nobody said, "Wait a minute, time out, you can't do that." So I think we have a disturbing bent in that direction. And I'll just make one other comment concerning this, because I've been thinking a lot about this and why this is the case. And let me suggest that the reason that we're moving in this direction and the country is comfortable in this direction and the media go along with it and so on, in my opinion, is because since the progressives took over the education system in the 1960s, we've raised a couple of generations that have no civics. They've never been taught what we were taught, people of my generation or even yours, Mitch. We were taught civics in school, and we were taught the founding of the country and the basic principles and the constitutional principles. And students aren't taught that anymore. It's been removed at most states. It's been removed from the curriculum. And so we have people who have never been taught the fundamental basic constitutional principles, the importance of liberty and rights and so forth, other than in the sense that the United States is bad and we ought to be opposing it whenever we can. And what passes for civics is taking students out and marching against something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is coming home to roost now. And Americans don't have a firm grounding in constitutional principles. And so nobody seems too upset, because as long as, and here's the danger in it. People say, well, it's important because, you know, if people will stay at home and so forth, we can beat this virus and so on. Well, of course it's important. There's always a good intention. There's something out there. And so, you know, once the government can mandate seatbelt use or use of a helmet when you're riding a motorcycle, where is that in the Constitution, or where does the government get the authority to tell people to do that? And people say, well, it's a good idea. You should wear a seatbelt. And I agree. I would wear a seatbelt whether it was mandated or not. The question is, can the government mandate it? Do you have a right to be stupid? These days, people seem to think the government knows what's best, and the government knows what's best for you. And so as long as they're acting in good faith, then it's okay. And I mean, that's led to, in world history, that's led to a number of dictatorships.
Mm-hmm. Help us as we kind of think through the, you know, sort of a Romans 13 principle, that a biblical principle of submission to authorities and government, as it relates to some of the things you just spoke about in terms of, you know, the government's extent to which they can tell you to wear a seatbelt or a helmet when you ride a motorcycle, or even beyond that. Yeah,
well, as my students can tell you, I'm a very strong advocate, supporter of Romans 13. I see Vanessa smiling. She's been in my class. I'm a very strong advocate of Romans 13 and the principles there in terms of subjection to governing authority. So I'm not advocating revolution. I'm not advocating rebellion. I'm not even advocating civil disobedience. I'm just advocating being upset and making sure that authorities know that you're upset, and having some protest about these kinds of things. And I'm not advocating violating any laws. You know, the seatbelt situation is a law, and so you should follow it. I think you should follow it anyway. It makes sense, but you should follow it because it's a law. Likewise with the helmet situation and other things. But in our system of government, we have a right to protest. We have a right to express disagreement. And it just concerns me that there aren't enough people who are expressing disagreement or expressing concern about what I think are overreaches on the part of government officials.
So, you know, you see a lot of people out on social media who are upset and who are making their arguments, and that's certainly, you know, at this stage, without being able to gather and have those conversations, that's one way to do that. You mentioned earlier civics education. Talk to me a little bit about how students can find careers or find ways that that they can actually go beyond, you know, just a rant on social media or even just a vote during election times. What are some of the ways that people, believers, can get involved in, and how can an education support that or direct that?
Yeah, and by the way, you just mentioned, you know, people aren't gathering to do this, and this is part of the problem with the mandate against gathering in public. Freedom of assembly, the whole purpose of freedom of assembly for the framers of the Constitution was to be able to express disapproval of government en masse. Mm-hmm. And we can't do that now because they aren't, you can do it in groups of 10, I suppose. But just yesterday I saw a guy was arrested because he was out surfing by himself. So it's not just groups of 10. You know, when you have the stay-at-home order, Anyway, so this is part of the problem that you can't really gather. But anyway, back to your actual question. Our students, as they are students, have been very involved in the political process. We've had students who have worked in the office of the local congressman, work on the campaign of the local congressman in the 2016 successful campaign by our former local congressman. One of our students, while she was a student here, not a graduate, but while she was a student, was actually in charge of his social media branch of his campaign. And another one of our students was in charge of all of the door-to-door operations in that campaign. That student that was involved in the door-to-door campaign, the year after he graduated from here, was actually a White House intern. He's sitting right next to Donald Trump in the White House intern photo. And the other student is now a law student at Pepperdine University. We had another student in a previous campaign, 2012 or 14, I can't remember which, 12 I think. She was actually in charge of the campaign of a candidate for Congress. She was the campaign chairman, or I shouldn't say that. She was in charge of all of the media activities of that campaign. So we've had students who, while are students here, have been working in the local congressman's office or working on the campaign. We've had graduates. One ended up in a managerial position in just a few years after graduation. Started out as a volunteer, and a few years later, it was in a managerial position in the local city government here in Santa Clarita, and was asked by the former mayor of this city, who was elected to the state legislature, was asked to go to Sacramento and be his legislative analyst. And she didn't want to leave the area, so she didn't go. But and we've had students engaged in other states, working with the Speaker of the House in the state of Washington, working with the Secretary of State in Illinois. We had one of our graduates who, just a couple of years after she graduated, was in a top level position with a cabinet officer of the country of Canada, and worked closely with this cabinet officer and with actually the Prime Minister of Canada. And they asked her to run for office, and she decided to become a missionary to Uganda instead. But she had a big political career, possibility in Canada. After a few years in Uganda, she went back home to visit, and they tried to talk her back into politics, but she went back to Uganda. So there's just a lot of different ways. We've had people who have run political action committees. So being involved in state government, local government, Congress, we've had some of our students who worked in the office of, as I said, representative, not only here, but also in Washington, D.C. We have another student who is currently the legislative analyst for the National Council of Governors. And so there's a lot of ways that you can get involved in politics, a lot of things you can do. There's also non-governmental organizations that our students have been involved in, working, for example, to stop human trafficking and other types of things. So there are a lot of opportunities to get involved and to be involved in politics. We haven't had any of our students hold elected office, but I don't yet. The only one that I know of that actually ran for elected office is one of our graduates who went to law school and is a lawyer, and he's an assistant district attorney, and he ran for district attorney and he lost, and so he's still an assistant.
So that's some of the career paths that our students are out representing the school and the Lord in those ways. Give us an idea maybe of some of the coursework and what's it like to be if you wanted to take a political studies track at Masters, what are some of the courses that you take that would help prepare you for that? Yeah, our major is called political studies rather than political science.
because when Dr. Stead and I created it, we didn't believe that political science is necessarily the only or even the best way to study politics. There are a number of ways to study politics, and so we called our major political studies because it mixes political science with political philosophy, political theology, other ways of looking at the political realm. And so our major is kind of a combination of those things. And so students would study the great thinkers, political philosophers of history. This semester, for example, I'm teaching a class on Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, who arguably is had the most influence in modern times on Western politics, including America's founding fathers to some extent. But we study Plato, Aristotle, John Locke, all the way through history, and then also in the Christian realm, Aquinas, Augustine, John Calvin, Martin Luther, and so a lot of political philosophy. And then on the other side, our students we have a political theory track in which students would really focus on all of that. We actually one of my graduates who's a musician in Nashville, and she was talking with a band whose members went to Stanford, and they all were political science majors. And so they were comparing notes, and she said that they were all very jealous of her because she had studied Plato and Aristotle and all these greats, and that they had never studied anybody before 1990. And that's because it was a political science thing as opposed to political studies and the wisdom of the ages. And so there's a political theory track, and then we have an American politics track in which we study what you would get basically anywhere in terms of Congress and the president and political parties and political communication and the various aspects of American politics. And then we have a constitutional law track that's primarily for those who are planning to go to law school. It's largely run by Professor Crawford, who I mentioned earlier, who is a retired judge. And it's designed basically to get students prepared for first-year law, which our students have done very well, by the way, in law school, and getting into good law schools, and also performing well once they're there. So those are kind of the three tracks that we have. And if students major in political studies, we have a core group of 7 courses that sort of introduce you to each of those 3 tracks, as well as other things like the course I'm teaching this semester, The Christian in Politics. That's one of our core courses that we think is critically important for a Christian to have a particularly biblical view and understanding of politics. So students would have an emphasis in one of these 3 emphases or more. Some students do 2 or 3 emphases. And then they take electives also so that they can reach out and take courses in other parts of political studies.
Okay. Well, I certainly could pepper you with questions all day, but I'm going to turn it back to Vanessa now and see if there's any of our guests that have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Thank you, Mitch. All right, well, it's at this time that we're open for questions and would love to hear from you. So go ahead and open that Q&A bubble at the bottom middle of your screen if you would like to hear anything more specific from us. Just give a couple more seconds here, and if there is nothing, we'll just go ahead and wrap up. All right, well, thank you so much.
It looks like one popped on there.
Oh, great, great, great.
It looks like it to me anyway.
Oh, sorry, let me just check that out there. Okay. Can either of you just take a moment and talk about dual enrollment?
Yeah, absolutely. So our dual enrollment program is very similar to what other schools offer and community colleges offer. Um, uh, and we have all of our Gen Ed courses. I'm just reading the question here to make sure I answer it directly. As a dual credit student, you can take classes online from our suite of Gen Ed offerings, general education offerings. And you can, those credits, as they do in many other places, those can count towards your high school diploma as well as beginning a college credit, earning college credits, excuse me, on your report there. And so, you know, this is really a great way for you to get prepared for college. You can earn advanced credits as a high schooler, a junior and senior. And it's a great way to just get into the mindset of studying at the college level. And a lot of students have free electives in their senior and sometimes in their junior year that are available for them. And this is just a great use of your time. We have it's a significantly lower tuition rate than when you're in your 4-year degree program. And so these are great option for you if you are looking to even if you want to transfer to another school, if you want to start and take some classes from the Master's University, our credits are transferable to other institutions. We always tell students that each institution has the prerogative to choose to accept credits from anywhere, but we have students that take our credits to other schools such as UCLA and these kind of schools. But we would hope that give you a taste of some of our professors and our curriculum here at the university. So see a couple other questions there.
We have a couple of questions that look fairly similar. Just try to put them together here. So do you think it's a wise decision in light of the present age to pick a major that's marketable, even if you're planning to go into ministry full time? And then additionally, how can a political studies major prepare you for a path if you're on the path to ministry?
Okay, let me answer that. I was going to actually say, but I felt like I was talking too long, that I was talking about the various things that our graduates have done in terms of politics, but our graduates are all over the map doing all sorts of things. Political studies is a good general major. I always tell students they should major in what interests them, because the key is to finish. The key is to get a degree. 60% plus of Americans go to college, but only 25%, 27% actually graduate. And what employers want is college graduates, not people who've gone to college. So you should major in what interests you, because when senioritis sets in your junior year of college, then it's what interests you that will get you to go to class and get you to do the work. And so political studies, I think, is a very good general major because it teaches you a number of useful skills that can be applied in just about every area, namely ability to read and read critically, ability to write and write well, and the ability to think and to communicate with others. And those are all elements of political studies that translate well into other areas. And we have a number of our graduates are missionaries. Several of our graduates are pastors. We have graduates who are in law enforcement and in the military. We have graduates who are in teaching. We have graduates who are in business. We have graduates who are stockbrokers and financial analysts. So we had one of our graduates, political studies graduates, featured in Forbes magazine a few years ago because his stock projections were higher than any other company in America, than all the big companies and so forth. So you can do a lot of things. Well, and obviously we have a number of them in law. One of our graduates is a Superior Court judge in Arizona, appointed by the governor. And so our graduates are involved in a lot of different fields, and you don't have to go into politics or law if you major in political studies. You can go from there into a lot of different areas, and our graduates are doing that. And it's more about skills. And it's more about the ability to think and to write, and those kinds of things that prepare you for jobs. And the Wall Street Journal has had a number of articles talking about how liberal arts is really now the best preparation rather than a specialty trying to focus on some particular thing. The liberal arts give you skills that are generally applicable that can be used in a number of different areas. So you're not locked into something, especially if you focus on something and then ultimately you don't like it. It gives you the opportunity to be flexible. That's what I would argue, is that majors like political studies that give you broad preparation in terms of being a thinking person, thinking critically, writing well, reading, and so forth. We had one of our graduates who works for a glass company, and he won a national award for writing an article about glass because he learned to write well. And so these are skills that are broadly applicable.
Great.
And by the way, I noticed that someone on there had said something about, can you double major or can you minor in something and so forth? And you absolutely can double major. Political studies, for example, I have one of my majors right now who's a double major in political studies and mathematics. And I often get people who are double majors in political studies and Bible, or something else, occasionally political studies and business. So yes, you can double major or minor in various things.
Great, thank you. Just another question that's come in here. They're asking, would a master's degree be necessary if pursuing long-term political science?
Probably, depending on what you mean by long-term political science. If you want to teach in the area, then absolutely you would have to go on and get advanced degrees. But not all of the things that you do in government or in politics require an advanced degree. Last time I looked, about 29% of our graduates have gone to graduate school, but they didn't all go to political science graduate school. They went to seminary or to other, some went to business graduate school and so on. But most of the people that I was talking about before don't have master's degrees. Some of them do. It just depends. But if you're going into it for teaching purposes, then you absolutely have to get advanced degrees. You have to get ultimately a PhD to teach at the college level, a master's degree or credential to teach at the high school or below. But other than that, it's generally not necessary. What you do is you go out and in some cases you volunteer and then work your way up the ladder. You get attached to some particular person and sort of ride them up. In other cases, there are just openings that you apply for, and you don't need an advanced degree for that.
I'll just say, interject here. Many years ago, I was a graduate of the Master's College before it became the Master's University. Was a history and political studies major. And one of the things that it helped me do was it prepared me to be functional in graduate school. And so graduate school seems like, sometimes it seems like an intimidating and daunting task, but the preparation that I had in this department was really critical for me as I went on to graduate school and did my master's degree, my doctoral work, to help me. And I didn't end up finishing my academic career in history and social studies, political studies, but rather the skills that I learned there they were able to allow me to follow the opportunities that the Lord provided for me, and to ultimately to do that and to build a career in higher education. So
let me just give an anecdotal situation. There's a young woman who graduated a couple of years ago. I mentioned earlier had helped in the local congressman's campaign, who's at Pepperdine Law School. And she was sitting in her first year law school class under a very intimidating professor that intimidates all of the students and bangs on their desks and that kind of thing, which you don't get very often, but apparently this guy's read the Paper Chase or something. Anyway, and he asked a question about the Federalist Papers. And she was the only one in the class that could answer the question. And so he came over and he sat next to her and he said, I need to get to know you. You're obviously an outside. So it completely broke all of the barriers and so forth, because she had had my Federalist Papers class and knew about the Federalist Papers. And so having a political theory background along with con law generally helps, for example, if you go to law school. In fact, the pre-law advisors say that the best preparation both to get into law school and to succeed in law school is philosophy, and the second best is political science. What's interesting about that is our major is a combination of philosophy and political science. And so our graduates, I think, have a real leg up and are successful. We just had last year our first graduate from Harvard Law School, who was one of our political studies graduates. And he's the first one because he's the first one to apply to Harvard, and he got in. So you're not disadvantaged if you come from the Master's University to go to any school. We've had our graduates, for example, just for law school, accepted into 16 of the top 20 law schools in America.
I think
I can't hear you, Vanessa.
Sorry about that. That wraps up the Q&A. I'll just give a couple more seconds if you'd like to post one more question in there. And if not, we'll wrap it up.
Looks like one popped on.
Oh, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mitch and Dr. Frazier. We appreciate hearing from you. That was very informative, gave us a lot to think about. Thank you to our guests for joining us this morning. We invite your questions still, even after this session ends. Feel free to contact the admissions department if you have any other questions about academics, departments, life at TMU, or anything that was discussed here today, and we can direct you to the right person to talk to. Thank you very much. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. You take care.
Bye.